Twisted Tea and Myrtle Beach wholesaler Better Brands Incorporated. Know our consumers enjoy relaxing days on the water with Twisted Tea's original hard iced tea in hand. It's important to remember drink and boat responsibly. Choose to be or designate a sober skipper before leaving the dock. Do it for your family and your friends, your passengers, and everyone else on board. Twisted Tea salutes all sober skippers who take a pledge. Cheers, and we'll see you on the water.
Realtree has always had a connection to the fishing industry and the outdoor lifestyle. In 2016, Realtree expanded on the traditional business of creating the world's most effective camouflage patterns to create a fishing brand and family of patterns designed to connect the woods to the water and strengthen the bond between the two worlds. We couldn't be more excited to be working with the industry's top brands, retailers, and anglers to continue our growth, and we hope that you will join us. Enjoy Realtree fishing patterns inshore, offshore, on the lake, or at the dock. Learn more about the extensive line Realtree fishing patterns, apparel, gear, and more at Realtree.com. Trilogy Outdoors.
All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Trilogy Outdoors, where we talk everything fins, fur, and feathers, and we're going to talk about something that affects pretty much everything that's got fins, fur, and feathers today on the show. You've lined up a really cool guest, and real quick, let's talk about your guest you've lined up.
Yeah, we've got David Strickland with us this week. David's going to tell us a little bit about fire in the national forest. We use fire a lot in the low country, especially where we have longleaf forest, but it's good. I mean, fire can be a good thing, can be a really terrible thing if it's not managed properly. And so we're going to get into that. We're going to get into some what I consider to be federal overreach. We're seeing it everywhere. I think we might have talked about it last week. NOAA and certainly their overreach.
Oh, yeah.
In the red snapper realm, we're seeing NOAA get involved in even more so on the right whale scale now.
Oh.
There's a proposed rule out there. Did you know?
Can we talk about it?
We can talk about it. There's a proposed rule out there to stop any vessel from 36 to 63, I think. Any vessel from 36 foot to 63 foot from 0 to 20 miles offshore, you cannot exceed 10 knots.
No.
That's the proposed rule.
I like my response to your text. How many people do you know that have hit a northern right whale?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know one recreational fisherman that's hit one.
You and I both spend a lot of hours on the water. I've seen two.
Yeah,
that's it.
I think I've seen two as well, and I've never hit one.
I didn't hit them. I was scared to death, though. I didn't get close enough.
Yeah, I mean, they're pretty obvious when they're out.
They're huge.
They're huge, and they're blowing, and, yeah, you see the steam. But anyway.
Federal overreach.
Lots of federal overreach, and it's going on probably in your backyard. It's going on in the national forests all around the country, and it's going on in our national forest right here in South Carolina, Francis Marion National Forest. Anyway, that's what David is here to talk to us about a little bit today. David, are you on the line?
Yes, sir, I am. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, David Strickland. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and you formed a group quite a few years ago that's 6,000-7,000 people strong now.
Yes, sir, that's correct. Just a brief bio on myself. I was raised in a hunting and fishing family by a father who was first in the Navy, then graduated from Clemson University in forestry and wildlife management. Obviously, I fell into those lines along the way, and I got a degree in biology and environmental sciences with an emphasis in vertebrate and invertebrate zoology. And from there, went on to work for the Department of Natural Resources, the United States Forest Service, and later was a game warden for the Department of Natural Resources. I left that, the federal and state agencies and went into the private sector. Started a wild game management consult business about 22 years ago. And, under my tenure as a consult, I've become very successful. I mainly do pro bono consults now, as I've been blessed in various financial arenas, but I don't know how many thousands of acres over my lifetime that I've consulted on and actively and physically managed. So that's kind of who I am in a nutshell. Having worked for both the state and federal agencies, I noticed a trend many years back where we started going from what I would call a hook and bullet style management. And actually, the teachings in these universities kind of transitioned as well from that hook and bullet to more of like a warm and fuzzy endangered species, apex predator importance style management. Uh, One of the things, as you brought up, we're seeing a lot of federal overreaches in the area of prescribed fire. And just to touch briefly on that, what happened, as many people know, is that the United States and our national forests fall under the National Forest Productivity Management Agreement that's been in place for a long time. So our national forests are supposed to support forest products, forest management. That's actually one of their top priorities and objectives.
All right, back up
Those
just a
came
second.
under attack. If anybody can remember, like the snowy owl and et cetera
Yeah.
out west.
David,
Yes, sir.
back up just a second. Before you get
Yeah.
too far down that road, just for our listeners' purposes, the national forests are all governed by, with I guess, with the exception of those that are actually within a park, are all governed by the Forest Service, right?
That's correct. So what you have is you have the national parks and
Yeah.
you have national forests.
Okay, gotcha.
And then you have the National Park Service, which is, predominantly the management agency over the national parks. You have the United States Forest Service, which is over our national forests.
All right, and the people that we are talking about today, and the management of those forests would be the Forest Service, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct. United States Department of Forestry Services, or commonly known as USFS, United States Forestry Service.
Right.
That's correct.
And they are charged with taking care of those forests pursuant to that agreement that you were just talking about.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is
Go ahead.
Yeah. And so a big part of that, under forest productivity is forest products, i.e. dimensional lumber, framing lumber, et cetera, also paper production, things of that nature. So obviously there was a lot of logging all the way, mainly we saw it in the Northwest through the Western states, but in the Southeast also, is in the Francis Marion National Forest, the Sumter National Forest, the Croatan, which is up in North Carolina, the Ocala down in Florida, the Ozarks in Arkansas, et cetera. Daniel Boone, there's a whole list of giant national forests in the Southeast. Those were also under sustainable logging practices. So I guess we call it the anti-logging zealots all formed up together, mainly under some very large nonprofit organizations, and primarily one that was called Earth First, another one Sierra Club, and that tagged in later to the Nature Conservancy. And these groups started forming really large, high-funded organizations, and they used those to overpower the United States Forest Service and get full-scale logging moratoriums placed on them. They literally sued the United States Forest Service. And so as these lawsuits began popping up over and over, the Forest Service was losing its productivity through the process of logging, which was its number one, budget funder, so to speak. That's where the majority of self-sustaining funds came from to run the United States Forest Service. So as they became in that pinch, obviously, whether you're a state-funded agency, federally funded agency, or private agency, profits and sustainability are key. So what we started seeing, and I'm just going to call it, just the timeline as it was during the Obama administration, huge climate change policies and directives came into being, and one of those was the Fire Resiliency Landscape Act. And under that was a directive to fire harden our national forests. Fire harden means to produce a fire resilient landscape. Through that means they directed millions of dollars towards the longleaf pine introduction, and then they were off to the races. The races led them in such a direction that fire now became their budget sustainment category. It's what predominates everything within the United States Forest Service at this time. Last year, the annual fire budget for the United States Forest Service was $3.2 billion with a B. And so as you can understand, when there's that much money on the table, a lot of things started being pressured.
Can I
So
can I stop you right
Wow.
there? Back up just a second. So,
Wow.
in the past, the money production for the forest came from the production of timber, right?
that's correct.
All right. Now you're saying the production of money comes from fire. How does fire produce money? Make that connection for the audience.
Well, so fire does not produce,
Right.
whereas forest products produce not only a renewed ecosystem, through the process of clear cutting. It's a process in which the management of timber and forestry activities literally sustains itself and can profit, whereas fire produces no profit. It is labor intensive, money intensive, and it comes with a very high degree of liability to a healthy forest. So there is no correlation there. So what happened was, with the occurrence, and mainly through the media, because large scale wildfires have always existed on our landscape, but as the urban population moved into these areas where they did not used to be, these wildfires started creating, catastrophic events, burning down homes and et cetera. These developments were not fire hardened, and there is a way to fire harden a development within a forced setting. It's pretty common sense stuff. We don't have to go into that. But at that point, during the Obama climate directive, millions of dollars were funneled towards that advent of a fire resilient landscape. That segued and got channeled off into, okay, we need to increase prescribed fire to decrease fuel loads. And the one tree that's really out there that can really take a lot of fire without damage, it's called a fire resilient species, is the longleaf pine.
Mm-hmm.
So there's really no correlation between making money with timber and making money with fire, unless it's coming from federal grants. And that's what's happened. The budget for the United States Forest Service blew up from about 1.5 billion to 3.2, and predominantly about 80% of the United States Forest Service budget now is fire related funding.
But it's not organic, right? I mean, that's the point I was getting at. The organic funding is when a product actually produces something. I mean, right? I mean, the product
Correct.
the product was timber, and
Correct.
it clearly produced money on the open market. This is not an organic production of money this is a political function, right? I mean, this is people in Washington saying this is a priority for us, and therefore we're going to spend the taxpayers' money on it, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, which
that's
is
correct. And there's multiple fingers in that pot.
yeah.
And one of the other agencies that is capitalizing from that fire resilient climate change policy is the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, because they got charged with, and you can see it just about anywhere you go now. When you see any policies and or action stances from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, it's predominantly going to be endangered species.
Yeah.
It has very little action stance on production of wild game, waterfowl, et cetera, all the way down through, any of our hunted species. They've been highly neglected.
Well, it seems like not just neglected. I mean, I hate to jump in and stop stop this train right there, but it seems like they're not just neglected. It seems like they're managed around. That's not even a strong enough word. Seems like they're managed despite their presence. The forest is managed despite their presence for the purpose of endangered species. In other words,
yes.
The deer, the quail, the turkey, the things that predominantly, the duck, the things that predominantly inhabited the forest prior to, let's just say, 1995 for fun. Things that predominantly inhabited the forest prior to that, they can now go away because it's more difficult to keep a deer, a turkey, a duck, a quail alive and happy in a forest, in a fire-ridden environment. Well, I guess that's enough, right? It's hard enough to keep them alive, much less make them happy, productive breeding populations. It's virtually impossible if you're going to excessively fire a landscape, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So what's happened is the United States Forest Service works hand in hand with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service actually, through management regulations and the federal level of agency directives, is over top and supersedes the United States Forest Service. The United States Forest Service is commanded through the Endangered Species Act to not perform any type of actions which jeopardize an endangered species. And obviously throughout the Southeast, the two big species that really have taken over the entire management plan in our national forests are the flatwood salamander and the red cockaded woodpecker.
All right, so
go ahead.
Let's pause right there for just a second, because I think this is important for everybody to understand. This is the inflection point, at least for me. The Forest Service in our national forest, here, at least here in the Southeast, there are other issues in other states, certainly, and we can talk about some of those too, but the issue here in the Southeast for us is that the Forest Service is managing for the salamander and the red cockaded woodpecker to the detriment of deer, duck, turkey, and quail, the things that predominantly existed in the forest 25 years ago. Did I say that correctly? Did I say that succinctly?
Yeah, that's correct. So in essence, when you take and manage for what we call single select species management, it's a protocol. If you're doing that, you are absolutely using a deleterious or destructive management policy for all the other species. The unique thing about wild game management, and you have used several that are key, throughout the nation, the number one harbinger of budget and monetary value and economics that are related to hunting are the white-tailed deer. And primarily cervids. When you move out west, it's going to be elk and mule deer. And the Northeast, it's going to be moose. Obviously, in the state of South Carolina, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, it's white-tailed deer. Secondly, behind those in the Southeast, it's going to be the eastern wild turkey. Those kind of run hand in hand. Our national forests don't have a ton of waterfowl hunting on them. And then, fourth would come your quail and your woodcock.
Right.
So if we're managing for just one species, we're not managing for the primary, this is what I call the big four. But if we're managing for the big four, white-tailed deer, turkey, waterfowl, quail, then you're providing an umbrella that produces positive effects for all types of other species, whether it be songbirds, your pollinators such as butterflies, honeybees, and et cetera. But when you start managing for the red cockaded woodpecker and the flat salamander primarily, and in the majority, you are creating deleterious ecological effects to those big four that we mentioned.
All right, real fast before you move on from that, how many acres is the Francis Marion?
It waxes and wanes, but right now we're sitting at around 285,000 acres.
All right, 200.
There's some other contingent acreage that is coming into that realm and some that's leaving that realm, but they call it 265, but I keep up with all the monetary exchanges, so we're really looking at around 280 to 285,000 right now.
All right, so for our purposes, we'll call it 285,000 acres. So one of the things, if you waterfowl, it's real easy in the waterfowl arena to figure this out. If you do a lot of waterfowl, and that big areas that are well managed with rest areas produce ducks for everybody, right? I mean, we've talked about this before on the podcast. The places in, let's just say the Ace Basin and the Santee Delta. The places in the Ace Basin and the Santee Delta, the Gun Club, we used to call it the Gun Club. It's now called Santee Coastal Reserve. And you got 50,000 acres of managed wetlands, what should be managed, managed wetlands. And then you've got plantations that are really well managed, even more well managed than the state-run stuff. Those pieces of property draw ducks, draw waterfowl from all over the place that are flying down the eastern seaboard, and that gives opportunity for public hunters. The same applies to these national forests. If you're not producing waterfowl, deer, turkey, and quail in the national forest, everybody else is suffering too. Everybody else is suffering. And so the policies that we're seeing the Forest Service and DNR's complicit in, I'm sure, the policies we're seeing being perpetrated by the Forest Service is hurting South Carolina for the only benefit of the red-cockaded woodpecker and a salamander.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, David. I just had to restate that. Every now and then,
you're absolutely correct.
every now and then I get on a little kick, and this, to me, it just feels like everybody needs to understand that we are being managed by the federal government is managing our wildlife into extinction on the Francis Marion for the benefit of a red-cockaded woodpecker that does us no good.
We've talked about this with
and
quail
multiple
forever.
other species as well. So
Yeah.
one of the things I've learned in this battle, and this is how the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate came to be. People started noticing what I was noticing. They knew that I had, a past history in working with the United States Forest Service and the Department of Natural Resources, and just people from all over the East, really, not just the state of South Carolina, that I had met in various ways, started coming to me and going, "Hey, man, we're seeing this, we're seeing this, we're seeing this." And likewise, I was seeing the same. And it really started about 2010. So prior to 2010, there was very little, we'll just call it high intensity, large scale growing season fire. It was actually non-existent. The cutoff date for fire in the Francis Marion was March 15th for, about 75 years.
Which
And
is right.
during that,
Right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
perfect. So before you move on with that comment, David, let's talk about good fire for just a second. There's such
Sure.
a thing as good fire. I mean, most of us that have property and try to really well manage and maintain our property use fire. We use controlled burns. There's a purpose in that, right? But the problem comes when you start talking about high intensity, especially growing season burns after March 15th. Why is that? Tell the audience why that is.
Well, as a private land manager and having, when I was in the United States Forest Service, I worked specifically in fire ecology and prescribed fire. So I learned from some of the best prescribed firing guys, probably in the world, definitely in our nation. The sole purpose of prescribed fire is really to remove fuels and to convert those fuels into your nitrogens and your usable carbons and other organic matter. It's a quick recycling. It's it's an injection of nutrients back into the ecosystem. The proper use of low intensity prescribed fire, especially during the dormant season, sets everybody up, all wild species, for a very productive spring, because it's basically given a recharge. All that unusable organic stuff that's sitting there that's slowly decomposing, when you use fire, it just bam, it immediately releases that. It's like an injection of vitamins to someone who's sick when
Right.
the forest needs it,
Right.
or doesn't need it. It's just an added bonus. On the opposite end of the spectrum, from low intensity dormant season fire in all of its positive attributes, is high intensity large scale growing season fire. So when you have a high intensity fire, you create a lot of mortality in your various mast producing trees. And when I say mast, I'm referring to both soft mast, which is going to be your mulberries, your persimmon, your dogwoods, your black cherries, etc., and your hard mast bearing species, such as your white oaks, your red oaks, your hickories, etc. Those trees that I just mentioned are not fire resilient. They're very, very, very sensitive to fire. They actually have, however, people want to say whether God developed it, which I believe, or the adaptation is that the leaf litter typically holds moisture so that fires won't really rage through there, creating a high intensity effects. The big thing that we're seeing, and I'm certainly a proponent of the use, I use a lot of fire, prescribed fire. We use it properly. We watch our fire day indices, days since rain, fuel moisture, wind direction, and etc. It's one of the cheapest and most valuable tools in a land manager's box. It produces great habitat. It injects your nutrition back into the ecosystem at a rapid pace. It's a wonderful tool. But what we're seeing in our national forest, tying all the way back to that fire budget, that $3.2 billion fire budget, and that single select species management for the RCW, red cockaded woodpecker, and the flatwood salamander, is that now the Forest Service has become pressured to hit budget marks to keep budget acreage marks to keep the financial budget where it needs to be. So they have started really getting away from proper post-firing effects. They're not worried about that anymore. They're just worried about the fire on the ground, and they're pushing the categorical indices on the days of which they burn. Days when you and I would absolutely never burn, they're lighting up 2,500 acres at a time. And during the growing season, people often don't understand the growing season, but the growing season is when you've just come out of dormant season, i.e. the winter, and your trees and your various forbs start showing growth. The sap literally starts coming back into the body of the tree. You start getting your buds, your leaflets, and etc. By design, Mother Nature sets the majority of her soon to be born offspring to be born during this period, because that's when all of the browse and your forbs, your trees, and et cetera, are starting to produce their new growth. So there's ample energy on the ground to support various offspring, whether it be a white-tailed deer fawn, a rabbit pup, your turkey poults, quail, and et cetera. Now, I'm not a person that will step out here and say that all growing season fire is bad, because it's not. If a private land manager knows his tract of land very well and he wants to set a thicket back, and he's got plenty of other areas, bedding cover, evasive cover, screening cover, and he wants to set a particular area back, hitting it with a very early growing season burn at first green up is a very good way to do that, if that guy knows his land, because he's taking very low risk and he's probably going to do it on a small acreage, 25 to maybe 50 acres.
Right.
However, the National Forest is doing this all through what we'll just call the offspring, or the fawning, or the poulting season and nesting season. So that's a problem there. What people often don't forget, and I've got away from just talking about wild game. It's well known throughout the birding world that our songbirds have taken an extreme hit. There's some people that say that our songbird populations are down by 40% nationwide. Our pollinator species are down by about the same. So if we remove the issue of wild game, let's just take that off the table. If you're coming in April 15th and you're lighting an aerial fire set, which is a prescribed fire set by the use of a helicopter, and what they call dragon eggs, which are ping pong balls filled with a potassium style chemical solution. They inject another solution into it that creates an internal combustion, falls to the ground, boom, it ignites. If you're doing that on 2,500 acres on a Monday, coming back and doing another 2,500 on a Wednesday, then you can imagine the amount of ground nesting birds, to include chuck-wills, widows, some people call them whippoorwills, your quail, your turkeys. But also, as we move up just a couple of feet, now we're talking about all of the Bachman sparrow, which is a threatened species. You're talking about your bluebirds. You're talking about your chickadees, your mockingbirds, your blue jays, all the way up. And if you have a high intensity fire that's top scorching, which means basically producing enough heat that it kills the top out of a 40-foot pine tree, now you've gone all the way into hurting your Mississippi kites, your swallowtail kites, your bald eagles, your ospreys, and et cetera. And people are missing that fact all the time.
Yeah. So hang on a second. We're talking about late season fires, which to me means anything after about March 15th. Okay.
Correct.
That's when first of March or so, second week of March, you start seeing green pop, you start seeing buds. So to me, that's a late season fire. We're talking about massive 2,500 acres at a time, all the way up into June, from what I could tell last year, right? Or this year.
And beyond.
And beyond, even some in July. Okay, so I mean that's basically year round. I mean,
Yeah, pretty much.
once you get to it. So we're not only talking about killing all the trees that support the wildlife, the mass-bearing trees that produce berries and produce acorns. We're not just talking about killing the trees. We're also talking about burning up, literally burning up the animals that are producing babies at that point in time, right? I mean, we've seen
absolutely.
we've seen pictures of turkey eggs.
And I'm
Go
not
ahead.
fond of the Nature Conservancy. What they once were was one thing, but what they are now is different. But they have a group called the ARC. It's an amphibian and reptiles group, and they go out and study. And over the years, I've gotten to know one of the gentlemen that works for it. I'll not say his name because he leans towards our side. There are no eastern box turtles in the Francis Marion National Forest any longer, except for in one little region, which is the watershed region, which does not see fire. And I can remember, and one of the reasons that I first, caught on to this is it was during turkey season. I was turkey hunting, and all of a sudden I saw a big plume of smoke, and I was like, "What in the world was that?" I thought it was a wildfire. I drove over to it. Well, it was a prescribed fire going off, and so I was like, "Huh, that's kind of strange." It must have been, I go in my heart. The first thing I do, and in my head is I'm like, "Okay, maybe this was an area. There was some invasive species in here that they needed to get rid of. Maybe the basal density was way too thick, et cetera, et cetera." But then I saw another one, and then I saw another one. And it was either the third or the fourth one, I had been going at a couple of turkeys in that block. And as I went back in there, I was like, I'm just going to walk this thing and see if I can find out what's going on. And during that walk, literally, it was a high intensity fire, so the majority of the understory was removed. I just started seeing these white orbs glowing off in the distance, and I was like, "What is that?" And I walked up to it, and it was eastern box turtle carapaces that had been killed.
Ooh.
And over the next 12 years, they basically were eradicated.
Yeah.
And in these core units, also, our mass trees have been eradicated. Like, you will not see a dogwood tree on the interior of these compartments. The only ones that have survived are those that are on the roadway, like literally right in the ditch. The same thing goes for our live oaks and, all the way through. I mean, the entire list of mass bearing species has been eradicated from about 80% of the Francis Marion National Forest.
It's just incredible to me that I mean, we hear these groups, they've got some of the loudest voices in the world when somebody threatens a box turtle, when somebody threatens a whatever, you name it. I mean, the sparrow, as you mentioned before, the Mississippian kite. Somebody threatens one of these, some stupid fool shoots one out of the sky, and we send them to jail, we send them to prison for months and months at a time. But it's
Correct.
okay. It's okay for the Forest Service to kill them by the thousands. I mean, really everything. I mean, they're decimating the turkey, they're decimating the deer, they're decimating all the game, but on top of that, they're decimating things like the eastern box. And nobody says a thing about it other than maybe you, David, you and the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate and this podcast.
Well, we started digging into this, and one of my partners, Wilton Stribling, is actually a retired Forest Service employee, and he was a fire management officer as well as a law enforcement officer. And so him and I just randomly bumped into each other and started talking, and he was like, "Man, this has gone off the tracks." And so him and I started cruising these blocks, and very early on, we noticed obviously the dead eastern box turtles and a sundry of other species. We found dead turkey nests and fire-killed turkey nests. But what we also started noticing immediately was the eradication of desirable hardwoods. And I'm talking about, I've got pictures of live oaks that were, 120 years old. We took a core on a dead one that had been fire killed. And, now I have these trees that are cataloged throughout the National Forest, and I check on them. And there was one that is 140 years old. And if you think about the historical aspect of that tree, it survived countless hurricanes, including Hugo. It survived 75 years of prescribed fire until this new firing regime took place. But on top of that, Stephen, what we started seeing is fire mortality to our marketable pine. So go all the way back to that forced productivity issue. And the Forest Service is literally killing their own marketable pines. And I'm talking about millions of dollars of marketable pine. And further, on the fringes of what we call a fire blowout, where the entire stand of trees has been killed, the fringe of that blowout are all highly fire stressed, which now, and this is a topic that is being addressed, but the salvage timber operation in the Francis Marion National Forest is about to go berserk because of all that fire stressed timber has made it the perfect infestation grounds for the southern pine beetle.
Yeah.
And over in Schulerville, there's literally there's a pine beetle colony. It was about 10 acres. It was reported 4 years ago. Nothing was done about it. And now they're literally logging 400 acres, clear cutting, salvage timber operation over 400 acres. And as I understand it, there's about another 10,000 acres in the hellhole unit that's going to have to be cut down because they've got little spotted colonies of southern pine beetle in them, and they're spreading rapidly. So, and in many of these areas, it's such an eyesore that people that don't even hunt, that don't even understand the implications of high intensity fire, started reaching out to me and going, "Why are all these trees dead? Is there a disease?" And I'm like, "No, it's prescribed fire." And some of the non-hunting groups started complaining about it as well. So the next thing we saw, there was an area right beside the United States Forest Service office on United Church Road that it was a giant. It's probably like 75 acres of just fire-killed, mature, marketable timber. And it stood there for about a year and a half. And then all of a sudden, the Forest Service contracted out a roller chopper to come in there and literally just knock down all the trees and ground them up. And the same thing happened over on Halfway Creek Road. And these big visible burns, there's one across from Boggy Head. But yeah, multiple implications of high intensity firing, and all tied back to that fire budget, and highly deleterious to many species, not just wild game.
Okay, so what do we do? I mean, we've talked about a lot of these problems that I would venture to guess most people don't know about. It's happening right under our noses in our backyards. What do we do about it?
So I have pursued this. I own two companies that absorb a lot of my time, but every spare second of my free time is spent on these management issues. I have sent multiple congressional inquiries. I have obviously gotten a large environmental style law firm involved, and we've hit dead end after dead end because everybody is tied in some form or manner to that giant $3.2 billion fire budget. So the biggest thing that we have had success with so far is myself and Wilton, caught the United States Forest Service outside of their own NEPA and their own EA. So EA is Environmental Assessment, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. So whenever the Forest Service is given acreages, they have to clear all this stuff through various policy agreements. And so 4 years ago, we caught them outside of their own NEPA on their growing season acreage. So we were able to hold off. They had to put a growing season fire moratorium because they have a budget for growing season fire versus dormant season fire. We caught them like 8,000 acres over their growing season fire allotment. So that was a big hit to them. And actually, when we found that and then FOIA'd several of the compartments, we found that the fire management officer at that time was doing many, many things wrong, and he actually left. So that was a big win for us, and by left, he was forced out. He wasn't fired. He wasn't disciplined, even though we probably lost about $22 million worth of timber, and countless wildlife species were put into harm's way and populations decreased, et cetera. He just got transferred. So that was a big win, and that takes everybody just staying on their toes observationally wise, letting me and Wilton and a few others at the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate know what you're seeing out there in your national forest. The same thing is now beginning to happen in the Long Cane District. They came here and captured several red-cockaded woodpeckers and turned them loose there, and it's basically their excuse to put more fire on the ground there. Mm-hmm. So the biggest thing that we've had success with is paying attention to their own rules and regulations, calling them out when they violate them, and then just public knowledge, increasing public awareness. Now, there is a massive media campaign that is run through the Nature Conservancy and the United States Forest Service, where they are just continuously posting these beautiful growing season fire effects. And you can get beautiful growing season fire effects on small tracts, but they're using that to show this glorified image, when in reality, the actuality of what's going on is the entire forest is scorched, charred, and in dire straits. It's the worst condition this forest has been in its existence. And the same thing is about to spread to the Inori district of the Sumter National Forest. It's already at the Long Cane. And now all the way up in the Andrew Pickens, they found a reason to start throwing more fire on the ground there, and it's for a shortleaf pine introduction, because they say the shortleaf pine is, in jeopardy. So it's just one reason after another to put more fire on the ground, more fire on the ground, more fire on the ground. Now, unfortunately, they tied this into, and this is where people start getting upset with David Strickland. They tied that into and got their fingers around, I'm not going to say the exact name of it, but we'll just say a nonprofit turkey organization.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happened, they ousted one of probably the most knowledgeable turkey guys ever to exist in the world, and that organization also started promoting the usage of growing season fire to all ends, regardless of what its own membership, its own board members, and everybody else said. Nationals shut that conversation down. Now, fortunately, as the wild turkey population started decreasing, we've been able to leverage that decrease and got Eastern wild turkey researcher by the name of Mike Chamberlain, who Mike and I don't always see eye to eye, but we see eye to eye on a lot of things. And he's certainly more knowledgeable than I in the world of the Eastern wild turkey. But he got inundated with questions about growing season prescribed fire, and he collected the funding to do fire research. And his research proved once and for all that high intensity, large scale growing season fire is highly destructive to the Eastern wild turkey.
Yeah,
so it's basically through the public becoming aware, starting to speak out against it, that I'm not going to say we've made headway, but we're bringing attention to the subject.
When NWTF started promoting fire without the caveats of dormant season, without the caveats of small acreage, without the caveats of all the things that traditional fire managers pay attention to, especially those that are concerned about wild turkey. I mean, I am a turkey hunter. I mean, I love deer, and I manage for deer, but I'm a turkey hunter, and there is nothing more concerning to me as a major turkey hunter than burning up a turkey nest, and really burning up all the mass-bearing stuff that turkeys eat too. But more than anything, burning up turkey nests in the middle of April, well, really more the middle of May, is just ludicrous to me as a turkey hunter. And I began to see this narrative from the NWTF a couple of years ago about how it's okay to burn up a turkey nest because the hen will come back around and she'll nest a second time, and that'll be a successful clutch. So don't worry about it. The benefits you get from a growing season fire outweighs the detriment of burning up a turkey nest. And I about exploded on those guys from the NWTF when that came out. I about exploded.
That narrative, she will re-nest, was the primary narrative used to shoot down all of our common sense knowledge and our scientific knowledge. That was thrown in our face countless times. And again, kudos back to Mike Chamberlain. They produced a massive amount of research, and now Turkeys for Tomorrow, who I staunchly support,
me too,
has also produced some invaluable research that shows, hey, wait a second, that first clutch is ultimately and supremely important to the eastern wild turkey's survivability. Yes, the occasional hen may renest, but the clutch size is smaller and it's got like an 80% less chance of survivability.
Yeah.
If we think about that turkey, Mother Nature knows best. She has set that hen turkey up to nest at a certain time frame, and that's so that those poults are born when our insects are emerging, our forbs are emerging, and all that succulent vegetation is still has a high digestibility index and a high nutritional index. And as those plants grow older, obviously the digestibility and the nutritional value decreases. So that second hen, let's say she does lay a second nest, and let's say, the typical clutch and the first clutch is somewhere, we'll just say 10 to 14, the average is 12. The second one, let's say it's 6 to 8. So even if she did hatch out all, we'll just call it 8, second nest attempt, she hatched out all 8. Those 8 poults are set up with Mother Nature against them from the get-go because now they have been delayed in their maturation process. So they're not going to have the same amount of insect life. They're not going to have the same amount of high digestive index plants, your little shoots, your little green ups, your new sprouts, your new leaves, etc. And what they do get access to has a lower nutritional value.
Yeah.
So it's a very complex web, but Mother Nature knows best. Now, to that point, Mother Nature also knows best when it comes to fire. And there's a big narrative that longleaf pines were the natural predominant forest ecosystem in the Southeast during the period of pre-colonialization. And we colonized and we cut down all those. Well, we have plenty of research now through various, sundries all the way from Lewis and Clark and outwards that have described, William Bartram, these guys that did all this big exploration that said that the Aboriginal Indians and Native Americans laid fire across the landscape. Now, we don't know how long that is. Some people say, well, it might have been this long or this long. But I'm of the opinion that the longleaf savanna was a non-natural, man-made situation. And I'm of that opinion, and I can substantiate it because there's only a couple of species that are adapted to it. The majority of species are adapted to a mixed pine hardwood forest, or even if it's a predominant pine hardwood forest, it has hardwood inclusions in it. So Mother Nature knows best. Biodiversity is key. So what the Forest Service is doing now is removing that biodiversity for a tree that, in my opinion, was in a savanna of that tree, a longleaf pine savanna, that was most likely, if you find somebody that's not tied to that money, they'll come out and tell you that most likely it's a man-created ecosystem over thousands and thousands and thousands of years of Aboriginal fire. And the guys that really study up on it are like, hey, okay, throughout the southeastern area, especially the low country, why would they have done that? Well, they did it because, number one, a longleaf pine savanna is virtually free of biting insects, and it allowed them to see any approaching enemies coming from a long distance, and it allows a nice breeze to sweep through the forest. That's the predominant. Now, granted, they also, knowing the lore of Native Americans, highly unlikely that they used growing season fire when they set these fires because they relied on the species of which we refer to as the big four for their survivability.
Well, it wouldn't make sense.
Just a little segue there.
No, but it makes perfect sense. I mean, if I'm a Native American, 1,000 years ago, watching the natural cycle of life, I'm not going to burn up my deer. I'm not going to burn up my turkeys or my quail.
Correct.
I mean, that's my groceries. Right, right. I mean, I'm certainly not going to.
And we can expound upon that a little further because now we have enough lightning strike data for the Southeast that shows the predominance of naturally occurring fire in the Southeast, other than a small portion of the lower peninsula of Florida. Experiences like 90% of their lightning strike fires, which is really the only course of natural fire, during the months of July, August, and September. Virtually none in March, April, May, and June.
Right.
That's the historical record of fire. And so we're putting non-natural on the fire at a non-natural size with a non-natural intensity. So of course things are going to go wrong.
Certainly seems like they have been.
Absolutely.
David, plug the Wildlife Syndicate real fast. Our hour is wrapping up. Plug the Wildlife Syndicate. How can people get involved? How can people help?
So right now we are just, I have a 501c3 nonprofit organization, the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate, but the biggest and easiest way to get involved is to find us on the most ungodliest of places these days called Facebook. And from there,
Imagine
you can reach
that.
out to myself or Wilton Stribling, and we have contact groups. I've got the Florida Wildlife Syndicate, the Alabama Wildlife Syndicate, the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate. We're probably soon to be merging into a new entity called the American Wildlife Syndicate to help battle these apex predator introductions, these huge apex predator protection issues that are going on, the huge aquatic pest or herbicide issues that are going on across the Southeast, which are destroying our waterfowl summering grounds and et cetera. But it's the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate. You can find us. We've done several newscasts. You can find us on Google. You can find us on Facebook, and sign up, because our motto is, make your voice count. And one of the biggest things we have doing is unifying people. And it seems that the anti-hunters and the warm, fuzzy, endangered species people, man, they unify and they fight hunting and they fight wild game management 24/7, 365, tooth and nail.
Yeah.
And we as hunters have to fight back. And we have to do that through political legislation, through our vote, and through our voice.
That's right. Having great people like this Senator Goldfinch over here on your side helps a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And Stephen knows it, and I'll say it for the public record. Stephen has been there with us and for us every step of the way. And I tell any of my supporters that are in his district to always look out for Stephen, because he looks out for us.
Well, David Strickland, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing the story and telling us the facts, telling us what's going on in our national forest. It's scary, but we all have a responsibility to get involved and to fight, like you said. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, sir.
I appreciate you having me, sir.
Okay.
All right, buddy. Thank you. All right, folks, ladies and gentlemen, that was David Strickland with the Carolina Wildlife Syndicate. I tell you what, if you didn't learn something there, you lost out. Pretty hard not to learn something in that.
I mean, it's just so it's I don't know, on lots of different levels. It's irritating, upsetting, disappointing. It'll make you angry, but it's not anything different though. English is just a different approach, right? I mean, we've always faced as outdoorsmen, hunters, fishermen, we've always faced those people that wanted to stop us from doing that. And this is just another example of that. It's just a different way of getting at it. And so we shouldn't be surprised, but we should just be ready to push back.
Nope, and it's just like you mentioned earlier, the whale thing. I mean, that's just all the people that are against what we do and what we enjoy.
Well, and when I texted you the other night and I said, how they could really stop anybody from hitting a whale, the possibility of anybody hitting a whale, you just stop fishing. You just ban fishing. I mean, I'm telling you, that's the ultimate goal for NOAA, is to just push the button, the easy button, and say, stop fishing.
Stop fishing.
Yeah, that's the easy button. And the excuse, whether it's a real excuse or not, the excuse is the northern right whale off of the East Coast. They've got excuses everywhere. They got excuses in the Northwest. They got excuses, in the national forest. They got excuses in the Southeast. But it's just the excuse of the day. The excuse du jour for fishing is the right whale. The excuse du jour for hunting in the national forest is the red cockaded woodpecker.
Yep.
We cannot let them run us over and stop this heritage that we have here.
Nope.
And
I was down on the dock today, and I'm telling you what, at 11 o'clock, if you look down that dock and looked at all the people coming back on boats from fishing and heard all the stories and watched all the smiles, I mean, how do you try to stop somebody from doing that? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. But anyway, I know our battles are ahead of us, and there'll be more different battles, just like the mosquito did for so long. I mean, many more battles ahead. And folks, by the way, if you have not listened to the Mosquito Podcast, episode 21.
It'll blow your mind.
It'll blow your mind. Go back and check it out. I've had several people stop me. So has Stephen. that brought it up. It was an incredible podcast. But make sure that you like and subscribe to Trilogy Outdoors on all of our platforms. That we're on every single one out there. So go out there, follow us at www.trilogyoutdoorsmedia.com as well. And remember, Southern English Radio Show every Saturday morning on the Gator 107.9 from 8 till 10. And, of course, our new Trilogy Outdoor magazine on the racks now. So, hey, we'll be back next week with another great show. The two of us are going out of town, a little vacation time with the family. So we'll be back next week. And as always, if it's pertaining to fins, fur, and feathers, you're going to find it right here on Trilogy Outdoors.
Trilogy Outdoors Podcast is a product of Trilogy Outdoors Media. All views and opinions of our hosts and guests are not necessarily those of our sponsors. Trilogy Outdoors is produced and edited by Trilogy Outdoors Media. Be sure to follow us on all the podcast platforms as well as our social media pages on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And also, don't forget our other brands, Southern English Radio Show and Walk 'em All Outdoor Magazine. To find more information, visit TrilogyOutdoorsMedia.com. And remember, if it's anything dealing with fins, fur, and feathers, you're going to find it right here on Trilogy Outdoors.